Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this sustainable finance workshop. This is a very well-timed event after the COP28 and a defined moment in the development of the sustainable finance regulation. Most of my comments today will come in my capacity as chair of the Sustainable Task Force of IOSCO. I will cover the discussion around the transition planning, the steps taken by IOSCO to develop global standards on sustainability reporting, and the situation of sustainable finance regulations overall. First, let me try to set the scene with regard to transition planning and where we are at this stage. There is growing awareness of the environmental and social challenges we face, no doubt from that, from climate change to inequality, and that has driven demands for investment that not only generate financial returns, but also help to address these issues effectively. We need really heavy investments in the next decade to finance the transition towards productive models that are more sustainable in the long term. However, for this transition to be possible, it is essential to have a solid regulatory framework that establishes clear rules and facilitates the disclosure of information and transparency along the entire sustainable investment value chain, thus helping to generate investor confidence. The construction of this regulatory framework for sustainable finance has been the focus of much of the agendas and efforts of regulators in recent years. It has been clear for several years that transforming the economy to a net zero one through public investment alone is simply not feasible. In order to achieve these goals, we will clearly require private financing. And private finance includes, of course, banking, but also capital markets. And of the two, I will obviously concentrate today on the latter, on capital markets. Here, the deciding factor are the preferences and the objectives of investors, be them retail or institutional investors. But these investors need accurate and comparable information in order to make informed investment decisions. So the whole sustainable finance regulatory agenda in capital markets, especially securities markets, hinges on one and only one element, which is to provide investors with accurate and robust information to allow them to make informed decisions. Let me briefly explain what we are doing in IOSCO in this respect. As most of you know already, IOSCO is the international standard setter for capital markets, and together with the G20 and the FSB, we set the global regulatory reform agenda for financial markets. Our membership is made up of over 130 jurisdictions and oversees 95% of the world's capital markets. So reflecting on the responsibilities of its members, IOSCO's objectives include investor protection, maintaining fair, efficient and transparent markets, and seeking to address systemic risks. One of the cross-cutting features of the IOSCO work on sustainable finance over the last few years is exactly this call for transparency in ensuring that investors receive timely, full, comprehensive and comparable information to mitigate the risks of greenwashing. Since we started our work in 2020, our work on sustainable finance, we have covered quite a spectrum of topics. Regarding corporate reporting information, IOSCO promoted the establishment of the International Sustainability Standards Board back in 2020. We called publicly for the development of sustainability information standards in 2021, and we worked together with the ISSB to develop an accurate, comparable, and useful framework for sustainability reporting worldwide. In July of this year, we have endorsed these standards, and we have called on our members to adopt, apply, or at least be informed by the ISSB standards in their own considerations, and we are now working with those members on capacity building and implementation of these standards. However, sustainability reports, which can be similar to balance sheets or income statements only provide an overview of a company, of its emissions and its risk and opportunities at a certain particular date in the past. Its force is an important factor, but is not sufficient for investors that are interested in companies working towards a net zero balance sheet. And this is where transition planning is important. By setting out the company's objectives and proposed actions for transitioning towards a low-carbon economy, the transition plan should provide investors with useful information about the medium-term plan and the risks and opportunities associated with that plan. And in this context, capital markets participants, such as asset managers or rating agencies, use these plans to supplement their ISSB disclosures by providing their clients with information on fund development, ratings, indexes, or track record levels. However, these transition plans are only realistic if they are clear and if they are comparable. Otherwise, they could encourage greenwashing, which would undermine the integrity of sustainable finance and undermine, in turn, investor confidence. So the question is how to ensure reliable, forward-looking information. Organizations and companies set emission reduction targets. They commit to monitoring their progress on climate action and reduce their exposure to climate-related risks. A climate transition plan is an instrument that helps organizations to align their climate ambitions. This alignment is achieved by establishing specific strategies and clear accountability mechanisms to track progress. On the other hand, investors are seeking to understand the readiness of companies to transition towards a lower carbon economy, and to do that, they need more transparent and more granular disclosures. If the disclosure requirements are too high level, then there is a risk that companies provide vague or useless information to investors. COP27 last year was the start of several significant announcements around creating credible climate transition plans in preparation for regulatory change. More generally, this year in 2023, in the climate disclosure landscape, we have had some very important milestones. The International Sustainability Standards Board released its standards for sustainability reporting by issuers. The European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, EFRAG, also published its EU Sustainability Reporting Standards, the ESRS, that are highly aligned with the ISSB ones in those areas in which they overlap. And recently, the UK Transition Plan Task Force has published its disclosure framework and accompanying implementation guidance. Let me just go briefly through the transition aspects of those three main and very important initiatives. Precisely one of the most notable aspects of the ESRS E1 standard is the requirement to outline a transition plan for climate change mitigation. This plan goes beyond acknowledging climate change's importance. It is a strategic roadmap for making a difference, and it should encompass, among others, companies' material risk and opportunities on climate change and how the company manages them, financial effects on the business over the short, medium, and long term, the company's plans to adjust its business model, the methods and actions the company plans to implement to achieve its goals, timeliness and timeline, for implementing those measures, and a robust approach to monitoring and reporting progress. Now, the ISSB standards, the international ones, also include some partial disclosure rules in this regard. Companies have to disclose information to help investors understand the impact of climate-related risks and opportunities on their strategy and their decision-making, including their transition plans. They are not required to create a transition plan or to set targets. However, a company needs to disclose those plans and targets that it has set or is required to set, including how it plans to achieve any climate-related targets. The requirements aim to increase the transparency of those disclosures. For example, disclosures about transition plans will include information on the key assumptions and dependencies that a company has used in developing its transition plan, and how the company is currently resourcing the plan, or how it plans to resource that plan in the future. And finally, in the third place, the UK perspective. The Transition Plan Task Force, some call it TPT, has developed a sector-neutral disclosure framework for best practice transition plan disclosures, alongside implementation guidance and sectoral guidance. To drive good practice, the TPT framework, the UK framework, applies 3 guiding principles on ambition, action, and accountability. Both the UK Transition Project and the ESRS, the European Disclosure Framework, are much more specific than the global one, ISSB, and they include information about the effects of this transition plan on the financial position, financial performance, and cash flow. All these initiatives are great to provide investors with useful information about medium-term plans and the risks and opportunities associated with those plans. However, in IOSCO's opinion, there are some issues that need to be addressed, like which are the most useful elements of transition plans for investors globally? What are the commonalities between the different initiatives so far that are worth consolidating? Or are there minimum features in regulation around transition plans that would be worth compiling so that countries that have not yet developed those can profit from the experience of others? So this is why IOSCO has created a transition plan project within the Sustainability Finance Task Force. And we are currently initiating work, and we expect 2 high-level outcomes. First, we will monitor practices in the formulation and use of transition plans by both corporate issuers on listed markets and asset managers, with respect to how they disclose those plans for the management of transition-related risks and opportunities. And secondly, in doing so, we will also seek to understand common components of regulatory or voluntary guidance where it has been put in place. We will also seek to gain a better understanding of how these transition plan disclosures are being leveraged to inform the design of transition-oriented capital market instruments and products, as well as how they may support decision-useful information for investors. While I would not want to presume the end output of this work that will go on during 2024, I can assure you that in developing it, we will seek to remain coordinated with other organizations that are working with the same objectives. Another key issue is what regulatory actions on financial markets can be taken to make progress to achieve the climate targets. For this transition to be possible, it is essential to have a robust regulatory framework that sets clear rules and that facilitates disclosure and transparency throughout the sustainable investment value chain, thus helping to build investor confidence. The construction of this regulatory framework for sustainable finance has been the focus of much of the agendas and efforts of regulatory bodies in recent years. And a lot has been achieved, especially in Europe. Therefore, before engaging in further regulatory actions, it would be worth evaluating the current regulatory framework to assess if it is being effective with respect to the planned objectives and to identify possible improvements or corrections. Some say the regulatory framework is still very complex. It's suitable for larger organizations and not so much for smaller ones. Others say that the goal should be international consistency in order to serve truly international capital markets. They say that it would be better to have a suboptimal global standard than 100 perfect but divergent local standards. That has been an important element in the strategy of IOSCO, this global consistency. And among these lines, the European Commission, in the communication made public in July of this year, already highlighted some deficiencies and stated its intention to continue to provide guidance to support the application of the rules in a clear and as effective as possible manner. Special attention is planned to be paid to evaluating how to make the sustainable financing framework more usable and inclusive precisely for small and medium enterprises. Furthermore, the European Commission is also rethinking certain approaches that it has introduced in the action plan, as evidenced by the European consultation on what we call SFDR, meaning a targeted consultation and public consultation on disclosure. My personal view, from a purely European point of view, and here I'm not speaking from the IOSCO perspective, is that the bulk of the regulation in Europe is already in place, is pretty advanced, and that we should address only marginal regulatory increases, like ESG ratings, but that the focus should now be on ensuring that the framework is being properly implemented. Let me turn to the work ahead of us at global level. I would like to mention the areas in which IOSCO will focus next year: assurance, carbon markets, and capacity building. Starting with assurance. After the endorsement of the ISSB standards in July of this year, IOSCO has concentrated in promoting global consistency in the assurance of sustainability-related disclosures. The logic is simple. If sustainability information published by issuers is not verified by third parties, it will not be credible and reliable for investors. So we are now in close coordination with the international standard setters on assurance, so the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board, the IAASB, and the International Ethics Standard Board for Accountants, the IESBA. Both of them are building new standards for assurance of sustainability information, which will be ready by the end of 2024 to be used for the assurance of 2024 financial and non-financial reports by companies worldwide. IOSCO is now committed to consider whether the standards that are currently being developed by IAASB and the IESBA could form a sound basis for assurance engagements over general purpose sustainability-related reporting. On one of the most important activities for IOSCO in 2024 will be the assessment of the SSB sustainability-related standards and providing feedback to the SSBs, meaning the standard setters on assurance. These will help to ensure robust standards applicable to all providers of sustainability assurance, be them auditors or other providers, within the parameters of existing governance, due process, and public interest mechanisms. Let me turn now to carbon markets, the second of our priorities. Implementing a carbon pricing mechanism such as the carbon tax or the cap-and-trade system can encourage businesses to reduce their carbon emissions, like the European Union case proves. Financial institutions may incorporate carbon pricing considerations into their risk assessment and the investment decisions. So in July 2023, IOSCO published one final report on recommendations for the establishment of robust carbon compliance markets, what we call CCMs. And this report intends to facilitate the implementation of compliance carbon markets across IOSCO member jurisdictions in a swift and efficient manner. It builds from the experiences of some more advanced jurisdictions that started earlier, and it gives other jurisdictions a solid starting point to avoid repeating mistakes that some jurisdictions made in the past with respect to these markets. In November 2022, IOSCO published a discussion paper on voluntary carbon markets, what we call VCMs. And voluntary carbon markets are in constant evolution, And this is why they will they need to attract IOSCO's interest and the important role that they will play as a complement to compliance markets is a source of why IOSCO is involved on those markets. And at the COP28 in Dubai, we have launched a full consultation, public consultation, on how to improve the integrity of voluntary carbon markets, which is a necessary process if these markets are going to develop properly. This consultation has attracted a lot of attention, and I am sure that this topic will be a centerpiece in the discussions around sustainable finance in 2024. And then capacity building, the third of the priorities. Regulatory bodies need to invest in training and capacity building to enhance the understanding of climate-related risks and opportunities and disclosures within the financial sector. This can help financial institutions to better integrate sustainability considerations into their decision-making processes. So following the finalization of the policy work on a few important areas like the ones I mentioned before, IOSCO is developing a comprehensive plan for capacity building and members' support, which would initially cover areas such as adoption and implementation of ISSB standards and carbon markets. So I conclude now. As you can see, there is plenty going on in the global discussion around sustainable finance, but many of the essential blocks are already in place or are being finalized. I have tried to cover the global international debate, but at jurisdiction level, there is much more going on, of course. What I think is important to stress is that financial regulation is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient one for finance to become greener. It is ultimately the responsibility of public policies, the preferences of investors, decisions by companies and governments, what will determine how much sustainable finance there will be and how fast this transition will be. The role of security supervisors and capital market standard setters is mainly to ensure that the information that decision makers will need is available, robust, verified, and comparable, which is the goal that we are collectively pursuing. Thank you very much for your attention.